So there's been some fantastic meetings at Marxism this weekend about some of the pinnacles of cinema, that anti-fascist films of the Italian neo-realists, the Battle of Algiers and revolutionary cinema. The films that I'm going to be talking about are not really in that category. And I think that horror as a genre is something that a lot of perfectly reasonable people avoid because they don't like being horrified and seeing gruesome things. That's completely fair. But also it's a genre that a lot of people write off as exploitative, misogynistic, just nasty and gruesome. And I think that's wrong, which is not to say there aren't lots of films that absolutely do meet all of those criteria, and they're not the ones I tend to watch, to be honest. But there is a huge swathe of horror films and massive parts of the genre, and particularly in the last 10 years, you know, we've seen a revival of this, of films that absolutely, on one level, contain social critique, and I'll talk about some of those as we go through. But just think about the most, in the last decade, films like Get Out, which is dealing with racism in the US today, The Babadook, talking about grief and parenthood and mental health, Blink Twice, about the kind of Diddy-style sex parties on a private island and women being drugged. Parasite, Bong Joon-ho's film, Oscar winner, about class and exploitation and capitalism. You know, and we've seen films and the horror industry responding to specific events that are taking place in the world at the moment. So since Roe versus Wade was overturned in the US and abortion rights have come massively under attack and been reversed, we've had at least 2 films and a TV series dealing with forced pregnancy and church and state conspiracies against women's bodily autonomy. So Immaculate, The First Omen, both about nuns and forced pregnancy and other things as well. But I think one of the points for me is that none of these things, like those 2 films I just mentioned, none of them are as scary as the real story of Adriana Smith, who died from blood clots on the brain a few months ago in Georgia in the US, and whose dead body was kept alive on life support as an incubator, so that a couple of months later they could pull an 800-gram baby out of her corpse just because of the rolling back of abortion rights. You know, to me, watching a film about nuns and conspiracies is not scary compared to that. And I think at a time like now, you know, where genocide is taking place in Palestine, where there's the constant threat of nuclear war, the climate emergency escalating, people have all kinds of feelings about that, and feelings run very high. And there is something about horror as a genre that is able to express things that it can be difficult to find a way to express in words. You know, so those kind of things that often we feel we have to repress to go about normal life, fears and dreads, feelings and desires that are socially unacceptable, you know, things that don't fit in to the heteronormative gender binary that we're all supposed to live in day by day. Bodies that don't fit the ideal of what we're supposed to look like. Taboos, you know, and so whether a film is a consciously socially critical one like Get Out or The Substance, or it's a B-movie that is a lot kind of trashier in the sense of, you know, that's kind of silly and you might watch it and laugh at it as well as be scared. Both of those things can capture something, can express something about those kind of fears and dreads and anger and rage that people feel about the world today. And I think this is something that does kind of speak to how we relate to films as, you know, as human beings. I mean, I did grow up in a household where we watched horror films, not really horrific ones, and didn't have a video machine until I was 15, but if, you know, the kind of ones that might be on the telly and I might stay up a bit late if I was quiet or sneak into the back of the living room if no one noticed. I do have quite a strong memory of this one scene from a 1960s American zombie B-movie, and I mean proper zombies, as in under the control of a voodoo witch doctor. And I remember this one scene where one of the zombies was compelled by his master to pull his own head off. Now, the film overall wasn't all that scary. It's not as scary as that scene sounds. And the special effects were laughable. You know, it was the kind of blood that looks like paint. It was this really obvious wax head that he pulled off his neck. And it kind of rolls away and it's quite funny. But actually, what haunted me afterwards was the idea of someone being under that level of control, being compelled by someone else to do something so self-destructive without questioning it. And what is work under capitalism, if not doing someone else's bidding in a trance-like state for 8 hours a day? You know, and this is the kind of thing that connects in, I think, with, you know, maybe not even consciously if you're 12 watching that, but something that sticks with you and something that I think horror can do, because it's already kind of putting itself beyond the pale. It's already trying to do things that you don't normally do in everyday kind of dramas and rom-coms and adventure films and thrillers. And there's something very attractive about the kind of unruly, untamed, disobedient creatures that you find in horror films. And not even just the monsters, but particularly what I've been looking at recently is women in horror films. And you just think about horror and kind of horror thrillers, people like Alex in Fatal Attraction, Glenn Close's character. And it's like her motto is, I will not be ignored, you know, and I'm not defending all of her actions, but she won't be ignored, you know, and that's what you come away with, I think. And so I've got a very short clip, just a 30-second clip to show you, and I'm not going to be showing anything really horrific today, and I'll warn you if there's anything too gruesome. This is a clip from a 1960s film that would fall under the category of hagsploitation. So this is the kind of films that Joan Crawford and Bette Davis ended up in after they were deemed too old to be romantic leads anymore. And just to explain the context, Straight Jacket is a film about Joan Crawford's character who came home one day to find her husband in bed with another woman and axe murdered them both. And then he's locked up in an asylum, and the film takes place 25 years later when she's just been released. So she's trying to get back into normal life, work out who she is again, be normal, not be locked up. And this is a few weeks after she's moved in with her daughter, and the psychiatrist from the hospital comes to visit.
Nervous?
Now, what I love about this little clip, and apologies for the poor quality, but I think her eyebrows keep you centred on where she is in the frame. It's so honest and true about how you can feel nervous as a middle-aged woman being judged by a man who is considered your superior, who has been fixing you and then sending you out into the world and then coming to check up on you, you know. And so it's just this little, the nervousness that she has, but then this little burst of confidence. She's like, no, actually, I'm not nervous. And she pulls that little move with the match there. And I think another film I saw recently that does a similar thing is called Office Killer, which was directed by Cindy Sherman, better known as a visual artist, a photographer, from 1997, which stars Carol Kane as a meek office worker who's forced to work from home. Obviously, this is long before COVID. But for her, home is a place of trauma. Home is the place that she escapes to the office from. So when they force her to work from home, she completely loses the plot. So next slide. Just a picture here from the film. Ooh, yeah. Oh, probably quite hard to see. But what happens is she loses the plot, kills her co-workers, and then brings them home, their bodies, and sets them up in her basement in an office-like formation. So this is one of her colleagues at a little table in her basement with a telephone, holding it in his blood-soaked stumps. after she's cut his hands off. And she ends up with several bodies arranged around her basement. And I think the film really taps into something that a lot of horror taps into, which is the home and the family as a source of violence, a place of violence and coercion. You know, I don't want to go into all the plot about, but you know, she's caring for her invalid mother in this film. Her dad had abused her as a child, etc. And there's all kinds of films that tap into that kind of that truth about the family that is rarely admitted in mainstream films. So I would say, you know, I wouldn't expect anyone to watch horror films who doesn't want to, but for me there are lots and lots of things that are scary in the world, but these films, some of them in lots of ways, give me little moments of comfort and joy within, you know, a kind of recognition of all kinds of situations that people face. And this is something about this is something about the power of film. There's a Marxist film critic called Robin Wood who wrote in the 1970s about horror. And he said that there's no better genre than horror to express and contest the oppressive nature of capitalism. Our culture operates by forcing us to repress every thought, impulse, emotion that goes against the normal standards, you know, of bourgeois society. And I think that's, you know, that horror can do that because it's already putting itself out there as something against the mainstream. Horror as a genre has more than doubled its market share of the box office in the US in the past 10 years, from 4.87% in 2013 to over 10% in 2023. Now, a lot of that is the big franchises, the never-ending Paranormal Activities, and as well as It, which more like an original film, but which was one of the biggest box office hits of the year it came out. Malignant, you know, all of these kind of juggernauts, and we keep seeing juggernauts being resurrected. I Know What You Did Last Summer, the Final Destination, and so on. But also we're seeing bigger versions of the kind of horror revival, socially critical films. So this year, of course, Sinners was a huge box office hit, quite rightly, in my opinion. It's the highest grossing original horror film since 2018, and that was A Quiet Place in that year. It's taken 365 million worldwide. Now, it's not pure horror, it's a mix of genres, very deliberately so, but it's a film that uses supernatural elements like vampires and voodoo and so on to explore the legacy of colonialism and racism and slavery. And I think it enables the film to do that in a really interesting way that's not just a straight history story set in the 1930s. And it stands in a tradition there. It's interesting that the first vampire story thought to have been published in the United States is called The Black Vampire, and it was published in 1819, just a few years after the Haitian Revolution. And it's really about the black vampires inciting enslaved people to revolution against their masters. You know, it's about the monster is the one who's trying to turn things upside down. It also stands in a tradition of black horror cinema. And there's a really good documentary that came out in 2019 called Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror, which you can find online. They start the documentary by saying the first black horror film was Birth of a Nation, you know, which is a good point, because in Birth of a Nation, about a century or so ago, black men were portrayed by white actors in blackface who were then, you know, sexual predators who ended up being lynched. You know, this is where horror started for black people in America. And the film goes through how that changed until they get to 1968 and the Civil Rights Movement and a real change of the balance of power, I guess, the battle coming right onto the streets in the US, police beating black people and protesters in the streets, enforcing segregation. And then in the world of horror cinema, George Romero comes along. And so I've got a short clip from the documentary begins and ends with, that's real footage, but it quickly shifts into footage from Night of the Living Dead.
All law enforcement agencies and the military have been organized to search out and destroy the marauding ghouls.
There's a zombie apocalypse, and we have a small group of folks who all sort of converge on a cabin house to survive.
It has a black protagonist in Dwayne Jones.
You can be the boss down there. I'm boss up here.
He's in charge.
If you stay up here, you take orders from me!
You can never quite tell if the white woman who Dwayne Jones is essentially saving is more creeped out by the fact that there's zombies outside or the fact that there's a black man in the house.
I was probably way too young to see it, but I was absolutely fascinated by the fact that there was this beautiful, handsome black man. That was the first time I probably saw somebody black in a movie, and they weren't a criminal, and they weren't a gangster, and they were the hero.
At that time, there was not a black character who was really a man, who was, again, who took charge of his fate, who wasn't waiting for the white man to save him.
Dwayne Jones's performance stood out for me. By that point, I knew I wanted to be an actor, and I said, okay, I was going to be fearless.
He's slapping white people upside the head. He's killing white zombie after white zombie after white zombie. This had to be horrifying to racists.
So I'd recommend you seek that film out. And rest in power Tony Todd, who was one of the talking heads there, actor who played the Candyman and lots of other fantastic roles, as well as in theatre. And it's interesting that horror audiences in the US are 15% more likely to be African American, and actually 23% more likely to be Latinx. And I'm sure there's many factors involved in that, but I think the experience of living in a racist society is likely to be one of them. And, this documentary came out in 2019. It was kind of prompted, I think, by the sense of something having changed with Get Out in 2017. It's one of the films that put the horror revival on the map. Jordan Peele, who was also one of the talking heads there, originally, and I hope this isn't spoiling Night of the Living Dead for anyone, but Night of the Living Dead has quite a bleak ending in that, after fighting off all the zombies and being the hero, he then gets shot by the white police who come, self-appointed police who come and try and impose order. Jordan Peele was originally going to use that same kind of ending in Get Out, and anyone who's seen Get Out, it kind of ends towards, there's two characters left, the black guy and his former girlfriend, and they're like out on the streets, and it's like, who's gonna kill who? And then you hear sirens, and it's a fantastic moment in that film because you go through this process in your head, and the characters do on screen, where the black hero is at first like, oh great, the police are going to be coming and they can save me, and then he's like, oh shit, the police are coming, they're going to blame me, and the white girlfriend is like, oh shit, the police are coming, and they're like, oh actually it'll be fine because they'll take my side, and of course it isn't the police, so everything's fine. And the reason he changed the ending to make it very clear that our hero escapes, wins, the girlfriend is left bleeding to death in the streets, is because he started developing it under Obama, but by the time he was getting towards making it, Donald Trump was the president, and Black Lives Matter had taken off, obviously, before that. And he felt he couldn't have a bleak ending anymore. He had to say to people, we can survive, we can get through this if we have backup, if we have someone coming with us, alongside us. And I think it is a really important film because some of the language, the symbolic language, the visual language that Peele uses in that film has become part of the lexicon now. People talk about black people in America being in the sunken place. This comes from the film Get Out. This idea of being almost hypnotized into accepting white supremacy, or accepting the racist society that America is. And I think that is something very powerful about film, how one visual metaphor can encapsulate a feeling or an experience that can be hard to express in words. I met a woman at a conference recently who had had a long battle to get a diagnosis of endometriosis. And this is something, if anyone's experienced it, it's a devastating condition for women, and it's also something that is very hard to get a diagnosis for. And whilst being ill, she'd watched lots and lots of horror films, and she documented her journey through clips and fragments specifically from kind of haunted house and ghost films in the horror genre, because they seem to be the only thing she found that really expressed the experience of being medically gaslit constantly, and not even just that, but actually at first feeling like something is wrong but not knowing what it is and not really trusting your own senses, like in a haunted house the first time you see the ghost and you think, no, that can't have been a ghost, and you carry on as normal. And then when you start to believe it, you try and tell someone else and they don't believe you and they dismiss it. And you start to doubt yourself. And then eventually you convince someone else, and that helps to give you the confidence to go back to the doctor and talk to them again and demand, a referral or whatever it is. And it's like there was no other means that she could find to express that experience than through the kind of gothic horror of being haunted, a haunted body. And I think body horror as a genre has a particular impact for those who face oppression based on their gender or sexuality. And think about some of the big films recently, The Substance, by a French horror director, Coralie Fagiat, who'd already done a couple of films that had done well in the more kind of in the genre market. And then The Substance had a much more wide appeal, and it had Demi Moore in it, and it's about the horrific pressure of beauty standards on women, particularly in the US. And it's about capitalism and how it, as an industry, keeps reconstituting that. And there's been a whole number of films that have dealt with that kind of issue. And I'm going to show you the trailer for another film which I actually preferred to The Substance, called The Ugly Stepsister. And it's a Norwegian horror film that came out this year, available to stream on Shudder. And it's taking the Cinderella fairy tale, and this is something that has been done a lot in horror films. And if anyone's read the original versions of Grimm's fairy tales, there's not much of a leap to a horror film. So this actually goes back to some of the versions you may have read if you got the censored version of the fairy tale. And it tells the story from the perspective of the so-called ugly stepsister and her battle in the household when Cinderella is there with her pretty privilege and her blonde hair and the perfect potential as a trophy wife for the prince. And it also comes back to this idea of the family as a site of violence and coercion. So I'll show you the trailer, and just a warning, there are some fleeting, gruesome images, so look away if you don't want to see them.
I'm going crazy. I've lost my mind. Best friend insanity. I've lost my mind. I'm going crazy. I've lost my mind. crazy.
Yeah, I recommend it. If that looks like the kind of thing. And I think it's great seeing this development in body horror because it's something that has been around. You know, Cronenberg is a great film director who's produced a lot of films that involve things emerging suddenly from bodies, things delving into bodies turning into different things, melding with machines, you know, and all kinds of stuff that is very, very interesting. And I think it's great that women filmmakers and storytellers are now, you know, more centrally a part of that genre or that subgenre, and thinking about these things from the perspective of women's bodies under attack at the moment. And I think it's also interesting, a lot of new work is being done by trans and queer horror fans and horror writers about their relationship to horror as a genre. And again, thinking about body horror and thinking about, you know, the way that the monster in a film might be othered, you know, the way that they're not like the rest of us and they're something different. And how this relates to the experience of growing up with this difficult relationship with your own body, but also with how society tells you you should be perceived and so on. And so there's a great book, which bookmark has copies, called Corpses, Fools and Monsters, The History and Future of Transes in Cinema. And the writers who are both trans talk about some of these relationships to particular films. It's a really great read, lots of chapters about different films. One of the examples they give is Under the Skin, a kind of sci-fi horror from 2013, directed by Jonathan Glazer, which is about an alien who has come to Earth and is in human form, in the form of Scarlett Johansson, which is lucky, and can't be, but she's not really a human. She's the shape, she doesn't have the parts, you know, and when she tries to develop a relationship with a human, is shocked to discover that actually she can't do that. She doesn't have genitals, you know, she doesn't have the right body to be able to engage in what human beings engage in, or what they're meant to be engaging in. And so Willow in the play, one of the authors talks about how that resonated with her as an intersex person growing up. And with that conflicting relationship. It also has a great chapter about the Silence of the Lambs and how it manages to make Hannibal Lecter's cannibalism less disturbing than Buffalo Bill's desire for gender sex. You know, like the weirdness of the way that trans was portrayed in cinema as a sexual projection and so on. And the fact that is starting to change and you're starting to get more trans voices. Films like Until the TV Glow from last year, you know, that really delves into the emotional experience of growing up and trying to understand your own identity. There's also, you know, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago called Queer for Fear by Hannah Botticelli, who focuses on gay LGBT plus audiences of horror, you know, and the way that there have been these safe spaces all across North America and Canada of horror film screenings for LGBT plus people, you know, midnight screenings. They'll go along, dress up, you'll have games, you'll all watch this film, you know, horror films, kind of trashy films, other genre films that are not necessarily mainstream, but where people feel this connection to the monsters or to the characters, the rage-fueled women, the monsters who are pushed out of society, and so on. And that it becomes a community building thing. And I think that's also true for women and kind of feminist horror studies has been a big thing recently. And there's lots of events, zines, podcasts, film festivals that are organised by women and most showing films directed by women and LGBT and non-binary people. And I mean, the film, I'm sure you people right at the beginning, Straight Jacket, with axe murders. I saw that at an International Women's Day screening where we were given a goodie bag on the way in with an inflatable axe. So whenever there was an axe murder on screen, we were all like listening and shouting and joining in. And it was great fun. We built this atmosphere around the idea of relating to the angry women on film that were meant to hate somehow. I went to the Final Girls Film Festival in Berlin this year, and there were lots of short films, again directed by women non-binary LGBT filmmakers. One highlight was a short film about a middle-aged woman who was having vampiric turns and having to feed on people, and it was a metaphor for the menopause. It was something that, it was all these short films that kind of talk about issues that still don't get talked about enough. And there was a great line in the film where she just, fed off someone who's drunk by blood. And her daughter says to her, "Oh, Mum, you can't do this at work." And it's like, that actually raises a really important issue about menopause and women in work. And, a campaign that trade unions are belatedly starting to organise around, but which is so underspoken about, something where we're all exactly the time. Horror films are able to take these issues and exaggerate them in a way that makes it feel very obvious and clear and relatable. Now, if you still didn't do the rain, I think this happened last year, didn't it? To return to where we started, well, this is just some of the books that are coming out of some of this new horror studies, popular and academic. These are the ones that I happen to have on my desk when I took that photo. There's also these ones that Marx has as well. I sit on your celluloid, crystal monsters, yeah. So I'd recommend taking a look at some of those. And the title of my talk, Now's the Time of Monsters, it's kind of a liberal translation of a quote from Antonio Gramsci, the Italian revolutionary. And the full quote, as it's usually translated, is "The old is dying, and the new cannot be born. In the interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear, and morbid phenomena as well." And he was writing in 1929, as Europe was battling between fascism and workers' revolution. He was writing from prison because in Italy the fascists had won at that point. But this kind of Gothic language, this idea of raising the spectre of monsters and morbid phenomena, runs through Marxism from the beginning. And that's because Marxism is trying to grapple with a system which is absolutely born out of blood and bodily fluids of human beings, being spent for the purposes of making profits. When Marx himself talks about capitalism, how does he describe it? Capital is dead labour, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labour. It lives the more labour it sucks. He also says it has a werewolf hunger for surplus labour. Look, more recently, 2009, Chris Harman published a book, Zombie Capitalism. And I'll just quote you a bit from the introduction. He says, "Faced with the financial crisis that began in 2007, some economic commentators did begin to talk of zombie banks, financial institutions that were in the undead state and incapable of fulfilling any positive function, but representing a threat to everything else. What they do not recognise is that 21st century capitalism as a whole is a zombie system, seemingly dead when it comes to achieving human goals and responding to human feelings, but capable of sudden spurts of activity that cause chaos all around." Is it any wonder that we have been completely culturally immersed in zombies for at least 20 years now, 28 days later, 28 weeks later, 28 years later now? The Last of Us, The Walking Dead, and there's lots of other examples of horror games as well, and so on, TV. Post-apocalyptic horror about survival, but also about found family a lot of the time. And this is an interesting concept that I think comes up a lot in horror films. The family is often a source of violence, coercion, badness in various ways in horror. Sometimes, in more conservative times, it's a place of haven and safety. But often it's a place of violence. But also often in horror films, people find other forms of family, of solidarity, of care in unexpected places. And I think, and often this is what zombie narratives are about. I think we live in a really unstable world. It's getting more unstable. Hunger is rife, environmental destruction is increasing, violence surrounds us every day, and mental health is, a crisis point for many people. If you want to read signs about how people feel about this situation, they're all there in the horror films that people are flooding to the cinema and to streaming to watch. You will find fear and anxiety and death and desperation, but you also find rage and anger and the refusal to be buried, literally, the refusal to accept the repressive norms that are forced onto us. And I think a lot of the time, by nature, horror films tend to be quite bleak. They often don't have a happy ending. Quite often they don't really resolve things, and things are left in a state of uncertainty, which is quite interesting. And I think that in itself poses a question to the audience, whether conscious or not on the part of the filmmakers, how do we resolve these fears? How do we resolve these challenges that are constantly being thrown at us of environmental, natural and unnatural disasters? Now, we're not going to resolve those questions in horror film first. That's not the place to look for their answer. We resolve them in life. That's our job, I think, as revolutionaries, as activists, as socialists, as people who are engaged in the struggles that are taking place. But I think the resurgence of horror films and the particular kinds of films that really have become so popular in the past decade or so actually say a lot about people's desires for something different in the future, but also a lot of confusion about how we might reach it. And I think for us, trying to find a way through the horrors of capitalism is what we're all about. Thank you so much, everyone. There's so much to think about there, and I won't answer all the questions, but I'll try and come to some of these points. I really want to thank the person who spoke a bit about, other approaches to ghosts and folk horror and stuff, what you're talking about in terms of the possibilities of, speculation about different kinds of futures and stuff. And, obviously I mostly talked about American, European films, but there is a whole interesting literature and, something to learn about different approaches to supernatural beings in other parts of the world, so for example, there was a film that came out of West Africa called Atlantics, directed by Matty Diop, and it's about legacies of migration and slavery and, the whole relationship of people from the west coast of Africa and the Atlantic slave trade and all of that, and ongoing, migration today. And, it's kind of, in Western traditions, ghosts do tend to be the bad thing that we're meant to exorcise, and get rid of. So if you've got a haunted house, you have to expel the ghost, and then you can be normal again. But I think in other traditions, it's often much more a case of ghosts are our relationship with our past, with our ancestors. There's a beautiful film, not really horror, but supernatural elements, called Uncle Boonmee, Who Can Recall Past Lives. It's from Thailand. Beautiful film, and it's got these kind of hairy, red glowing-eyed spirits that hang around the dinner table when this family goes back to the village, from the city back to the village where their family is from. And it's kind of weird at first, but then it becomes really comforting. It's about a connection with a history that can't and shouldn't be forgotten. It's not that your history is bothering you, like we are, taught that it is here somehow. We've got to get rid of the things that, that we're repressing. But actually it's about coming to terms with history and coming to terms with the past in order to be better able to shape the future. And I think that's something that I'm very much in favour of. And, and those there's already, lots and lots of films that many of us, I'm sure, are less familiar with that we should be looking out for. And the same can be said of, lots of folk horror as well, coming from different parts of the world. And there's quite a big, horror film industry in Latin America, South America, that is bringing out lots of interesting things around this, Central America as well. Elements of folk horror, elements of these kind of ghost stories, but in a different way. And, there are different traditions inside of horror. Another really interesting aspect is that, a great kind of subgenre of horror is the gentrification horror that someone talked about. And there's a whole number of prominent films, not least Candyman. There's two versions of that now. So there was the original one from the 90s, and then a remake a couple of years ago, 2021 or 2, I think, which was really interesting, going from where, the Candyman in the early 90s was set on this very rundown housing project in Chicago, and and now it's very much been gentrified, and it's about the role of artists and gentrification in the remake. But in both versions, there's this really contradictory relationship, isn't there, to your own community? Like, it's not that you want to be run down, but you also don't want to be run out of town. So it's like, where is the correct solution, which is not replacing poor housing with luxury flats, as they're currently doing in lots of London, so that people can't afford to live there anymore. But actually, how do you pull up communities? And I think that the example that someone gave around the Vampires versus Brooklyn is a really good example of people getting together, of collective action against the monsters who are trying to suck the life out of us in much more of a Marxist sense than in many other films. In that horror noir documentary, one of the filmmakers, I think it's the guy, I can't remember his name now, but he directed Count Blackula, which is a classic in the black horror canon. And he said he grew up with his dad saying, watching horror films, and his dad saying to him, the real horror isn't the monster, it's the white guy in the suit. And that's what he took with him throughout his filmmaking career. That where are we looking for the horror? It comes from the system. You see that in Night of the Living Dead, and some of its sequels, not others. And you see that as a thread that does run through a lot of horror. That the monster, often the monster is the othered person. The one that lots of people can relate to as people who are oppressed or othered in some way themselves. But also often the monster is the system. It's those bigger forces of racism, oppression, and exploitation. Quickly on the Cronenberg question and science, and coming back to this idea of speculation about the future. I mean, so long since I've seen Existence, I can't comment much on that. I think The Fly absolutely does a brilliant job of kind of combining different themes, doesn't it? Because it's partly about science and genetics and experimentation, and it's partly has the echoes of the AIDS crisis in the US in the 80s. And it feels, to me, watching it's a lot about cocaine addiction also, and the disintegration of someone who's succumbing to substance dependency. And it can do all of those things, and I think, again, coming back to genres like horror or sci-fi, other kinds of genres like that, they can do things that combine different aspects, different questions that we're trying to grapple with in really interesting ways. In the book Corpses, Fools and Monsters about transness cinema, they talk quite a lot about Cronenberg and the body horror and the science and stuff. And one film they talk about in particular is quite a recent one from the last couple of years called Crimes of the Future, which is about body modification. It's about a kind of future society where you can do surgery, open surgery on people without anaesthetic and without needing to disinfect, like there's no infection. So you can just do surgery on yourself or on other people whenever, and you're not going to get infected from it. So people do this now. They modify themselves. They cut themselves open for a bit and then wait for it to heal and then do something else. And the discussion in the book is really interesting because it's about how there is this utopian element to Cronenberg's work around science and those kind of possibilities of body modification, not as horror, but as something that is about another way that humans can interact with each other, with the world, with their environment, and in an open way that's not, so it's an odd film, but it's not particularly scary, it's not dystopian exactly, it's about possibilities, and I think there's a lot of room for that inside the genre that is quite interesting. Something I've been working on recently is about the two versions of Dead Ringers. So there was the 1987 film by Cronenberg, and then there was a TV series a couple of years ago starring and produced by Rachel Weisz. Dead Ringers is about identical twin gynecologists and their weird relationship with each other and their patients, and about reproduction and twins and stuff. And the new version is really interesting because they swap the gender of the twin doctors. In the new version they're women, in the old version it was Jeremy Irons. And they make it very much more about reproduction and questions of the profit motive in healthcare, particularly in the US, about who has access, to IVF and other methods of assisted reproduction, who should have access, what things are possible, should we be trying to reconceptualize things like infertility or the menopause, or should we be just delaying it by 20 years so people can keep being beautiful until they're much older and whatever, if we're rich enough to pay. And it's a lot of speculation, but a lot that's very bleak, because the only future they can see in that version is the one that's run by the likes of, or funded by the likes of the Sackler family. So in the show, it's a billionaire family that's caused the opioid crisis in the US that is funding their clinic. But the series is very much trying to put questions to you as a viewer about, what do you think the future is going to be, and the choices are not very good. I think in the series, the twin who wants a different kind of future that's not based on the profit motive ends up just choosing to die because she can't see a way to get that, and leaving the one who's happy to take the money from the rich people. Now, it's arguable if that's what the conclusion should be, or is. But again, I think the whole series poses questions about real issues in the real world, but does it in ways by pushing to extremes, in terms of body horror and what we're capable of as a species, but also the limits that capitalism puts on us as a species. So I think that, for me, the best thing about horror is the way that it can use metaphors to uncover social relationships. And the thing about capitalism is the way that it mystifies social relationships and kind of hides them from us, and we don't really see a lot of the time what is really going on around us, in terms of the transactions that we are involved in with each other. We don't see all the human beings who've been involved. When I go and buy a tin of beans from a shop, I don't necessarily think about the farmers, the truck drivers, the distribution centres, the canning factories, the shopkeepers, and they don't, and everything that has led to me having money in my pocket to buy a tin of beans. Yeah, there's all these human relationships that are mystified and hidden and just become about things, giving money and getting things. I think horror films have a way of kind of finding a language to express and expose some of those social relationships, and so there's a huge amount of potential. I'm not a filmmaker, but there's lots and lots of new people getting involved in horror now and trying to bring new and different voices to it. And absolutely, I've met people who use it as a therapeutic practice and have done for a long time, by the way, but I don't have time to go into that more. So yeah, again, whether or not you want to watch horror films yourself, I think everyone at Marxism Festival should be glad that there is a new wave of people involved in trying to use the genre as a way to critique the world we live in, to think about different ways of living, and to add to the voices expressing discontent and rage about the way that we live now. And that's something I think we all want to encourage.